Hello everybody, thank you for joining me this evening, everyone who's tuning in for our first foray into the book of Leviticus. Last time we had a sort of introductory session to the book of Leviticus, talking about some of the overarching themes and talking about the structure of the book, also the time frame of when it fits into the narrative of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And that it fits in, what do you know, right between the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers, filling a 1-month time span in between those 2 books. Like I said last time, a lot of people, when they're reading through the Bible, if they start at the beginning, they'll get usually halfway through Exodus, and then they start to get bogged down. There's a lot of ancient law code that they have to get through, a really big chunk of it, including the instructions for the tabernacle, and those might not be the most interesting thing in the world to read through. And then right after they get through all of that in Exodus, they get hit with Leviticus. You hit it like a brick wall, and it is trying to get through Leviticus, just reading it just for the words is a slog. It is difficult. It is rather boring. And even when you get beyond reading just for the words and instead focus on detecting underlying themes and principles behind things and the symbolism in it, it can still get really tedious reading through Exodus. So I hope that in preparation for this class you've read at least the first few chapters of Leviticus. Did I say Exodus again? I'm sorry. Leviticus. Read the first few chapters of Leviticus, because we're not going to go through it verse by verse. Instead, we're going to give a summary of these first sections. Hopefully, it won't take more than 2 classes. I just noticed the clock on the back wall of the auditorium is not working. So I have no idea what time it actually is. So this will be fun. I have no idea what time it actually is. I got no idea how long I've been speaking already, so this will be great. Let's jump in. Leviticus chapter 1, the first verse mentions, as we have mentioned last week, verse 1 plants us immediately after Exodus chapter 40. If you look in Exodus chapter 40, verses 34 through 35, it says, "Then the Lord covered the tabernacle of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, and Moses was not able to enter it, because the cloud rested above it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." So, as we discussed last time, the problem that Exodus leaves off with is that the glory of the Lord in this cloud has filled the tent, and Moses can't get into the tent to meet with the Lord anymore, and that is a problem. And so verse 1 of Leviticus 1 says, "Now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle, the tent of meeting." So the Lord is in the tent, and he's speaking to Moses from inside the tent, and Moses is stuck outside. So Exodus and Leviticus, it is no time in between the books. They just go from Exodus and straight into Leviticus. It's a continuous narrative. So as we go into Leviticus chapter 1, it talks about the first of a very important set of rituals. Remember when we talked about the structure of Leviticus, it begins and ends, sort of ends. There's like a little appendix section on the very end, which is like a call to action to be faithful to God's commandments kind of thing. But it begins with a section talking about rituals as a means of making Israel holy and pure so that they can safely enter the presence of God and worship Him. And then the corresponding section at the end is another section about more rituals, but that one's about the feasts, but it's still dealing with rituals as a means of keeping Israel holy and pure so that they can dwell with God and God can dwell with them without consuming them because of His holiness. So the first one of these rituals is called the burnt offering. Whenever someone brings an offering, they must bring their livestock. This burnt offering is brought, quote, verse 4, so that he may be accepted before the Lord. So without the burnt offering, you cannot enter the presence of God, and the burnt offering is made on your behalf so that you are acceptable before the Lord. Some versions are a little iffy on the wording, like apparently this one that I have in front of me, it's the King James Version. It says, it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. However, that is not what the Hebrew says. It says to make him acceptable before the Lord. So that's a little interesting thing that got left out of some versions. It is for atonement. You could say, oh, I'm sorry, I was misreading my notes. Verse 4 doesn't talk about that. Verse 3 talks about that. Right. It's an offering. It's a burnt offering. He will offer... I'm totally lost. Where does it say this? Verse 3. Well, anyway. The purpose of the burnt offering, it's important to understand the purpose for each of these. The purpose of the burnt offering, you just witnessed a really human moment right there, right? Where I was a little confused. The purpose of the burnt offering is to render the worshiper acceptable before God, and that is a way of saying, make it possible for them to be in the presence of God without being consumed. That's the whole point of Leviticus, and that's why it's the first thing that gets brought up. In the book of Leviticus, the way to make them able to exist alongside God, even though they are sinful human beings who make mistakes, right? It's a way of making it possible for them to exist with God. Note, with the burnt offering, and really with every offering that involves an animal, it is not the priest that kills the animal that is offered. It is the person who brought it, the worshiper who slays the animal, not the priest. Think about that and how that would... think about the message that would give. This is a thing that you have to do for dealing with sin, making an atonement for yourself. It's the idea that your sin brings death, and you can make the sacrifice, but you're still going to have the blood on your hands because your sin is on you, not on anyone else. The worshiper is also the one who is supposed to section and prepare the animal for offering. The priest's job is just to do the offering part. Meanwhile, the worshiper's job was to prepare the sacrifice for offering, and that means killing the animal and sectioning it in the proper way. And that's really, we have the idea that that's really grotesque, we think nowadays, and it kind of is. It's very icky, right? But, again, consider the symbolism, the message that it would get across. Your sins have consequences, And even if we have this system where you are spared from the consequences, right? Someone else has to bear the consequences. It is not that the consequences of sins get erased, but it's that they are transferred onto something else, the sacrifice. And the worshiper in this system of sacrifices has to deal with that fact. They have to reconcile with the fact that their sins bring death, and they propagate death in the world. The priests then take the blood and they sprinkle it on the altar. The word sprinkle is actually more like the word flick. They would have the bowl that has the blood that is taken from the sacrifice, and they dip their fingers in it and they flick it onto the altar. And then they would arrange the pieces of the sacrifice on the altar, and they would, of course, then let the thing catch on fire. The altar has wood underneath it that burns continuously. The next, I think, chapter 6 speaks about that the priests are supposed to keep the wood on the altar burning continuously, so they didn't have to really set it on fire, they just had to put it there and then it would start burning. And it is, well, it's burnt. And if you look in verses 9 and 13 and 17, it has the phrase, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. A pleasing aroma to the Lord. Verse 9, at the very end of it, an offering made by fire, a sweet or pleasing aroma to the Lord. And then verse 13, a sweet or pleasing aroma to the Lord. And verse 17, a sweet or pleasing aroma to the Lord. So the idea is, and this is something to understand about the sacrificial system and how it was supposed to, how the thought was that it works. The idea is that this animal was slaughtered and burnt, so it was made into smoke, And what happens when you burn something and it gets made into smoke? Where does the smoke go? It rises up, right? Think about the visual and then think about how they probably thought about it. It goes up, and the idea is the smoke and the spirit of this animal go up into the presence of the Lord, and it serves as a sort of advocate for the worshiper before God to render them acceptable. Render them acceptable before God. So when the sinner comes into God's presence, the following event would not be death. That's the purpose of the burnt offering, because the purpose of the book of Leviticus is to teach Israel what they can do in order to become holy like God, and therefore be accepted into His presence and not destroyed by His presence. And so they need the sacrifice to advocate for them. And this burnt offering was done if you look at the certain things that they were supposed to do, the certain sequences of offerings they were supposed to make when they did a certain thing that happens later in the book, you'll realize that the burnt offering is every time. It's every time that they have to go and make an offering, they have to have the burnt offering first, and then proceed to make whatever other offering it is. Because the purpose of the burnt offering was for them to be rendered acceptable in that instant to enter into the presence of God. The death that they would experience if they were to just waltz into the presence of God is experienced by the animal instead of the person. Note also that there are multiple options for what you could offer. It wasn't always that everyone needed to offer a bull. Not everyone needed to offer a sheep or a goat. because there were multiple options. You could offer a bull, you could offer a sheep, you could offer a goat, you could offer turtle doves or pigeons. So the burnt offering, if you had the money to slaughter a bull, you could do that. But if you didn't have enough money for that, you could slaughter a lamb or a goat. But if you didn't have even those, you could get a turtle dove or a pigeon and slaughter those. It was, everybody could do it. Everybody could make a burnt offering. If they were going to go into the presence of the Lord, this needed to be accessible, this sort of ritual, and it was. The bull is expensive, but not everyone has a bull or can afford a bull. So you could use a lamb or a goat, but not everyone has a lamb or a goat. So you could buy a bird and use that one. The birds are like the cheapest thing. No matter how well off or financially struggling someone was, they would be able to make the burnt offering. And essentially, like I said, the burnt offering was the means by which the worshiper was made able to enter the Lord's presence in order to do the acts of their worship. It had to be done every time. Every time someone was going in to make an offering, which is why, like I said, it is listed first. That makes sense, right? And for a long time, people thought that the burnt offering was just an atonement offering, like the sin offering and the guilt offering later on. If you've already read ahead, you know about those. Because some versions say that it's for atoning for sins. And in a way, I guess it kind of is, but it also has the other function of it's to make you able to enter into the presence of God. That's its specific function, which is why it is mentioned here instead of mentioning it in chapter, 4, when it mentions the sin offering, or 5, when it mentions the guilt offering. Those are for atoning for transgressions, but instead it mentions it at the very outset, in chapter 1, because it had to be done every time, and it specifically is related to the very purpose that the book was written, the very problem that it was trying to solve. So after the burnt offering, we get two offerings that are essentially ways that the Israelites could express their gratitude to God. And we're going to talk about these two, and then I guess that will be the end of the lesson, because again, the clock is broken, it's not working. I don't know, maybe it ran out of battery or something, I don't know. But we'll just end it after these two gratitude offerings. So in Leviticus 2, it talks about what is called the grain offering. And there are 3 parts to this. 1 is the flour, 2 is the oil, and 3 is the frankincense. They were to use fine flour. Flour is not expensive. It's not even expensive now, but it wasn't expensive back then either. Flour was not expensive. I guess buying fine flour, which is like the really good stuff, could be a little more expensive. But we're talking about an agricultural society here, not a post-agricultural society. I don't know how to say that. A society that isn't mainly agricultural. They were agricultural, so there are few people that would actually have to buy flour. There are a few people in Israel who would actually have to buy wheat or buy barley, purchase it. They would grow it. So the grain offering is about, being thankful that you have been blessed with a good harvest, that kind of thing. So this fine flour, I guess if you wanted to purchase fine flour, it would cost you more than normal grain flour. But you would make the fine flour yourself, and it just took more work to produce. More grinding, right? The oil was also expensive because it was, used for so many things, and it was kind of arduous to produce. That would be olive oil, of course. That is the main way that they created oil to use. And then you have frankincense, which is very expensive. Very expensive. Also, it could be made into a sort of aromatic, like an air freshener kind of thing, which, considering this is a time and place where they did not bathe very often, you could understand that something that smelled really good would be really expensive. So this frankincense added to the grain offering also made it into a sort of incense as well when it was burned. Now the frankincense was, I'll get to this later, there was a portion that was to be burned on the altar and a portion that was to be given to the priests as food. The frankincense was not part of the food. Have you ever tasted frankincense? It's disgusting, okay? You don't eat frankincense. The frankincense was only used on the what was called the memorial portion. That was the top part, and the priests, when they were making the offering on your behalf, they would take the top part of it, they would take a handful of it, and they would have all the frankincense in there, in that handful, and then they would burn that. And that was the portion that was made to God. It was devoted to God, and it would be burned, and it was called the memorial portion. The other part, however, was given to the priests. It was called a food offering. And while it was given to the priests to eat, it was considered as giving it to the Lord. Because the priests represent the Lord to the people, and also the priests are God's servants. So to give them the food portion is to give God the food portion, because they're working for God. The oil and the flour, like I said, would get mixed in, and then the frankincense would be put on top. And when it burned, it was actually a very pleasant thing. It's one of the only offerings in the book that wouldn't smell pretty bad. If you've ever smelled an animal actually burning, not cooking, but burning, that smells horrible. So the grain offering with the frankincense is really the only one of these that actually smells good. The grain offering could be prepared in a variety of ways, but the ingredients always remain the same. It could never have any leaven in it or honey. You could still give those with leaven and honey to the Lord. It just couldn't be offered up on the altar, sort of like an official grain offering. So if you only had bread with leaven in it, or you only had bread with honey in it, I don't know why you would only have that, you could still sort of donate that to the priests, and they would take that and be very grateful for that. But that would never get offered up on the altar. I can understand the leaven part not being offered on the altar, because there's the symbolism there with the Passover, no leaven in the Passover bread, that kind of thing. What about the honey, though? I don't really know why that was against the rules to offer that on the altar, so I don't know. But like I said, you could still offer those kinds of things to like a contribution to the tabernacle to feed the priests, but you could not put those on the altar. It would always be seasoned with salt. In fact, God makes a pretty big deal that it was going to be seasoned with salt, and that it should never lack salt. The reason why is salt, again, was very expensive, right? but also salt was known to be a preservative. And death and decomposition were a result. This is how the Bible frames it. Not just me, but how the Bible frames it. Death and decomposition are a result of sin in the world, and people's sin making the world that way. That death did not exist originally in the world, but it is because of sin that death and disease and decay, corruption, decomposition exists. And so all the sacrifices needed to be seasoned with, all the offerings needed to be seasoned with salt, needed to be seasoned with this thing that preserves things, keeps things from being decomposed. Those are just two reasons why it may be that salt was always required. Here's something that you have probably never noticed. Paul talks about in Colossians 4, verses 5 through 6, how we are supposed to treat other people. And he says, verses 5 and 6, walk in wisdom towards those who are outside, redeeming the time, and let your speech always be with grace and seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer one another. Let your speech be seasoned with salt. You might say that, oh, that just means, he's just saying that it's supposed to be, I don't know, something to somehow connect seasoning with salt to being pure or something. But keep in mind, Paul was an avid student of the Bible, and he definitely knew Leviticus. And there is actually nowhere else in the Bible where it mentions things being seasoned with salt, aside from Leviticus talking about these offerings. And so how we speak to and treat others, Paul says, he's implying, is like unto service rendered to God. And of course it is. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your, some translations say reasonable service, but others say spiritual service. It's an act of service rendered unto God, that you act and speak in such a way that is holy, that is not corrupted by things of the world that corrupt and those kinds of things. Also, a thing to note about the grain offering is that it specifically is said to be a first fruits. A first fruits to the Lord, verse 14 it says. First fruits implies that there is more coming after it. If you read 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lays that principle down pretty well to prove his point that Jesus was the first fruits of the resurrection, and if he's the first fruits, then there will be more to follow, and therefore Paul proves, yes, there will be a resurrection of the dead at the end of time. Leviticus is making the claim that the grain offering is supposed to be an offering of the first fruits of your harvest. So the harvest comes in, the first batch of whatever you have collected from your field, you use it as the grain offering. It's not to be eaten by you, it is to be dedicated to God. It's the first fruits of your harvest. Of course, implying that the rest of the harvest comes afterwards. Some have connected the principle underlying the grain offering, to what we do today. When we contribute of our means, we give of our means, and we pool our resources to help accomplish our mission here in our community, and also help fund other efforts to further the kingdom of God elsewhere. Some people connect the principles of the grain offering to that. And while there is a philanthropic angle kind of missing from the grain offering, unless you consider giving to the priest as philanthropy, but there is the gratitude angle that is still present. That when we give of our means to God, when we contribute, we are expressing our gratitude to Him that He has blessed us. And when you consider that the grain offering is the first fruits of what they gain of their profit, and the contribution that we give is also, in a way, the first fruits of what Christians make. Let me explain that. In the ancient world, Paul tells them to set aside every first day of the week. In the ancient world, you got paid at the end of the week, and then the beginning of the week, the first day of the week, was really the first day that you could actually do something with the money you made. They got paid on Saturday. And remember, the Corinthians are Gentiles, they're not Jews. So they got paid on Saturday, and then on the next day, which would be Sunday, they could, start spending that money on stuff, whatever they needed or wanted. It was the first day that they could actually use the money that they got paid with the evening before. So, to set aside, to give back to the Lord every first day of the week means that you are first giving, and then you can use whatever else. It's the first fruits of what you have gained. So, that connection checks out, I think. So then in Leviticus chapter 3, this will be the last thing that we talk about this evening, there is what is called the peace offering. Now, the name is a little misleading, as it makes one think that the offering is for making peace with God, but it is actually for celebrating peace with God. Let me point out how we can know that. Like the grain offering, it is verse 5 refers to the grain offering as a food offering. Verse 5 refers to the peace offering as a food offering. Earlier in chapter 2, the grain offering is referred to as a food offering, and we know what the grain offering is for. It is obviously for expressing gratitude that God has given you the first fruits of your harvest, so you give it to God. It's for expressing gratitude. Verse 5 of chapter 3 refers to the peace offering as a food offering as well. Meanwhile, the final two offerings that we'll talk about next week, the sin offering and the guilt offering, are not referred to as food offerings. Instead, they are stated as having the purpose of atonement. That's chapter 4, verse 35, and chapter 5, verse 16, for the sin offering and the guilt offering, respectively. So, the peace offering is not for making peace. It is for expressing gratitude concerning peace. For the peace between you, the worshiper, and God. Further illustrating this fact is the fact that when you made the peace offering, there would be a portion that was burnt on the altar. There was also a portion that the priests ate as the food offering, and then there was a portion that the worshiper ate. Thus, it is a communing sort of experience, communing with God and celebrating the fact that you, the worshiper, have peace with God. The peace offering would not be made before a burnt offering or before a sin offering or a guilt offering. Because if you did something sinful, you sinned, and you had to make a sin offering and a burnt offering, you would make those before the peace offering. Because the peace offering is for celebrating the peace that you have with God. And if you still have sin, then you got no business making a peace offering. You see how that works? Each of these sacrifices is for a particular reason, and none of the reasons actually overlap. The burnt offering is for rendering someone able to come into the presence of God. The grain offering is for expressing gratitude for the, you could say, the physical blessings that God has given you. The peace offering is for expressing gratitude for the peace that exists between you and God. And then the sin offering and the guilt offering are for different things that we're going to talk about next week. None of the purposes actually overlap. They serve a very particular function. So the peace offering is for expressing gratitude that you have between that exists between you and God, and we have a ritual that sort of serves the same purpose, or at least a similar purpose. There's a little bit difference. Like I said, there's a difference with the contribution too, the philanthropy aspect of it. There's a difference that exists with this ritual, and that ritual is the Lord's Supper. We call it the Lord's Supper, communion. I think the Catholics call it the Eucharist. I need to actually look up what that word means. Probably means something important. Eucharist. Good grace? Good. Charis. Grace. I don't know. Okay. But like I said, the Lord's Supper or communion kind of corresponds with the peace offering. The peace offering was for celebrating the peace that you have between you and God. And also there was the communing aspect with God, because you and the priests and God all shared portions of the peace offering, the animal that was sacrificed. And when we take the Lord's Supper, there are more things than celebrating the peace that we have with God, because as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, when we eat of the Lord's Supper, we declare the death of Christ. But also, we celebrate the memory of how we gained peace with God. How did we gain peace with God as the church? Well, through the death, the sacrifice of Christ Jesus our Lord. And what is the Lord's Supper a memorial of? The very same thing. The very same thing. And so the Lord's Supper is sort of the church's modern version. Modern as in like no longer Judaism. Version of the peace offering. And recall how Paul says that any who eats and drinks of it in an unworthy manner eats and drinks condemnation to themselves. Can you commune with God if you have sin in your life? No. Same way that you couldn't make a peace offering if you had some sins that required some sin offering or a guilt offering. You had to get those out of the way and then commune with God. Interesting symbolism and interesting themes connecting these things, that if you read Leviticus without that in mind, and you read it without the mind for figuring out sort of underlying principles and overarching themes, then you might never think of that. You might never think of that, and instead you might think, man, there's a lot of repetition in this book and a lot of icky stuff, and I don't like reading this. But when you understand that the Bible is not simply an instruction book, but instead it is something that you are to meditate on and consider in its fullness, in its entirety, then these themes start to jump out at you. You know? When you, obviously this section, the first section of Leviticus deals with rituals, and you think, well, does the church have any rituals that it does? Why, yes, it does. I wonder if there is any connection between our rituals of the church that the New Testament has given us and the rituals that the Old Testament gave to the Israelites. And lo and behold, there's some really interesting connections. All right, so that will be it for this evening. I have no idea actually how long I've been speaking. I hope I have not gone way over time. Or Catherine will be mad at me because I need to get home. So thank you for joining me, and I hope that everyone has a good rest of the week, that you stay safe and stay healthy, especially stay safe in the next few days, maybe even the next week or so, because I have a feeling that there will be a lot of unrest, no matter how the next few, or how this matter of who our next president is going to be happens. So stay safe, please. Keep in prayer those of our number who are sick or dealing with folks dealing with family in the hospital or the passing of family members. Also pray for Rebecca and Jim. Those storms that came through a few days ago, it actually made a tree fall through their bedroom. They weren't inside, they weren't in the bedroom at the time, and so they are safe, they're unscathed. But that is really a stressful thing to have happen and have to deal with, repairing the house. So please pray for them as well as everyone else who needs your prayers. There's a lot of people, and I'm sure you know, and I'm sure God knows who needs our prayers. All right, I hope to see you Sunday morning, and I hope that, again, you have a good rest of the week. God bless you all. Have a good night.